part of our commitment to free exercise, the free exercise clause and the First Amendment to the Constitution, part of what that means for people who have entered our nation's service is that we actually, when they undertake a certain sacrifice on our behalf and leave hearth and home to move to a distant place where the practice of their faith maybe isn't as easily available, we actually, as a country, have an obligation to them to kind of give the basic infrastructure for them to freely exercise their faith.
Welcome to the Napa Legal Podcast. I'm Frank DeVito, Senior Counsel and Director of Content at the Napa Legal Institute. So we have a special guest episode today. We've been trying to do these more often to highlight some of the most important issues covering religious liberty, the work of faith-based nonprofits in a wide variety of issue areas. So today we're doing something a little bit outside of our normal programming, but it's a really important issue that we wanted to highlight. By the time you're listening to this, we will have just covered this story on the military chaplain contract that was recently canceled. And so we have a friend of Napa Legal who we wanted to get on who really knows this issue well. So Chris Motz, I'm not going to go in depth on his bio. He's a senior counsel at the First Liberty Institute. You're welcome to go find him and his work there. He practices focused on First Amendment free exercise, Establishment Clause issues, particularly related to military service members. And he has a rich background working in the Catholic Church and in the field of religious liberty. So Chris, thank you for being here with me today.
It's a pleasure, Frank.
So just to start, let's give the overview, if you would, of what recently happened. My understanding, there was a contract that affects a lot of the kind of ancillary service workers who do a lot of really important contracting work with military chaplains, from liturgy to religious education. And a lot of those contracts were canceled, but you know this better than I do. So why don't you give our listeners a little bit of an overview of what happened?
Sure. So it kind of started to happen last spring when a major Army command that's sort of responsible for a lot of contracting within the Army decided it was going to cancel all outside contracts for civilians that might be employed in Army chapels on bases and posts around the country and around the world. It affects not just Catholics, actually, but kind of all chapel services. So our Protestant brothers and sisters, and then any other faith groups that would be working out of base chapels. But it's particularly important to Catholics, as we'll get into. So the contracts were canceled in March. We understand that there was a period of negotiation that sort of unfolded. And ultimately, the Army decided it was going to stand by that decision. And because the Army decided to stand by that decision, Archbishop Broglio, who is the ordinary, the Archbishop for the Archdiocese of Military Services, he put out a pastoral letter kind of explaining to the faithful what was transpiring. He did that in October. So as it stands right now, we're recording this in December. All of those contracts for the chapel services are canceled. They're not reinstated. And of particular importance for anybody being served by a Catholic chapel in particular, it would be the coordinators of religious education, Catholic pastoral life coordinators, and then musician contracts, so directly impacting liturgy as well.
Yeah, we'll get into the nuts and bolts of how military chaplaincies work and the different roles there. But one thing that was quite disturbing, actually, I read Archbishop Broglio's statement, and he was originally assured, I believe, by the Army that there were different professionals who would be taking over, who would cover these roles in catechesis and liturgy and so on. But my understanding from reading Archbishop Broglio's statement is that those positions filled in the Army, most of them are not Catholic, and some of them are not even religious. That's not a requirement of those jobs. Is that right?
That's in fact the case. So, that's what the Army has said. According to the Archbishop's letter, I obviously wasn't in those negotiations, but have spoken with some of his staff and understand just from the content of his letter. The Army has what they call religious support specialists, which would be an enlisted person who serves chaplains, works in chapels. And that's, imagine you're 19 years old, you've just graduated high school, you want to join the Army, you sign your enlistment paperwork, and they say, congratulations, Chris, you are now a religious specialist. You're going to support the chapel. And I might not be a religious person, I might not believe in God, but that's my job in the Army. And there are a lot of, very fruitful things these soldiers can do. But there are also some things they can't do, namely sacramental prep for Catholic kids. They can't do things that are uniquely sort of for Catholics to do in service to other Catholics and kind of passing on and living the faith.
Yeah, I don't think it would be an extreme statement or a stretch, at least for our listeners, to agree with the statement that people who do not hold the Catholic faith are not really qualified to teach it.
No.
So let's I want to go into some of the nuts and bolts of, like I said, how the military chaplaincy works, how a base chapel works, because most of the organizations that we work with, the ministries that we cover are private, right? 501(c)(3 nonprofit organizations. So this works quite differently. Can you tell me about how a chaplaincy works?
Yeah, I sure can. And I'll maybe just use my own experience on active duty in the Marines as an illustrative example. So stationed at 29 Palms, California, big Marine base, several thousand Marines stationed there. And there was, several Marine battalions of infantry and artillery, a lot happening, kind of field exercises and so on and so forth. There's also two chapels on base, a Protestant chapel and a Catholic chapel. And there were two Catholic priests that served the Catholic community out of the Catholic chapel. Um, Now those priests, they weren't just serving sort of the chapel community. And the chapel community would be, anybody that's showing up. It looked like a parish in many respects. Daily mass on Sunday, faith formation programs for adults and the kids, sacramental prep, as well as OCIA for people that might be interested in the faith. But one really important distinction from parish life is those Catholic chaplains, those priests. They also have, day jobs. A priest that just that I ended up becoming close to and still keep in touch with was also the regimental chaplain for the 7th Marine Regiment. So he had duties within that command, field exercises, advising the commander. So it's really, and that's one of the points that the Archbishop is drawing out in his letter is look, it's not, these priests are not just sort of running the chapel as if sort of that chapel parish, so to speak, is their only job. They also have obligations to those line units, those field units that they're serving, which makes it all the more important that they actually have the support staff that they need to serve the chapel community very well. So that example is my own experience. It'd be very similar in the Army, very similar in the other services as well. Is that those? Yes, the Catholic chaplains they're serving the Catholic parish community on in that sort of parish capacity, and I use that phrase. It's not the exact same thing as a parish, but that's the analogy. But they also have a full-time day job serving all the troops within whatever unit they're assigned to.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then I want to dive into a little bit of the specific features or distinctions of Catholic chaplains and Catholic chapels versus Protestant on military bases. And a couple things come to mind is that one, I know it's complicated how you actually get military chaplains because if I understand correctly, for Catholics, you generally have priests who are ordained for a diocese, and then they're kind of loaned is the wrong word, but they have to come from somewhere generally other than the military archdiocese. Is that right?
Yeah, that's my understanding as well, is that they remain incarnated in their sort of, quote unquote, home diocese incarnation. My understanding is that the only 5 clerics, maybe it's more if they have retired bishops, but so the Archbishop and his 4 auxiliaries would all be incarnated in the Archdiocese for military services. All the other chaplains are incarnated in, Diocese of Sioux Falls, for example, or the Archdiocese of New York, or whatever their home diocese happens to be. And then when their military service is concluded, whether that's only a few years or maybe it's a whole, career of service, they'll go back home and continue their priestly service, either in their home diocese or in many cases too, it would be a religious order that has sort of loaned them out for a period of time.
I would think because I know there's a huge shortage of chaplains. I mean, Archbishop Berlio's statement makes that pretty clear. I think he said the percentage of military chaplains who are Catholic priests is like 5.5%, even though like a quarter of the soldiers in the army, or maybe it's a little more than a quarter, are Catholic. So there's already a huge disconnect in the numbers. And then I would think it's probably fairly hard to get Catholic chaplains, especially when you have a lot of dioceses that are short on priests, that they're maybe not as willing to let priests go, or maybe, I don't know if there are a lot who want to sign up. Whereas on the Protestant side, I would think because you have a looser ordination structure and hierarchy in a lot of these places that someone who wants to be a military chaplain can just like go to seminary, get ordained, and become a military chaplain.
That's it, roughly speaking. Every chaplain has an endorser, sort of a religious body that serves as their sort of, their place of ordination, and then they end up getting an endorsement that is their sort of foot in the door to start serving in the military. But you're absolutely right about the numbers disparity. I think it's probably fair to say that this contract cancellation doesn't have the same impact on our Protestant brothers and sisters. Again, like you point out, the numbers are just different. So, and I think the Archbishop unpacks that in his letter that, there's one Catholic priest serving in the military for every 1,000 souls that he's serving. And for Protestants, it's a 6 to 1,000 ratio. So there's just a different, the numbers are very different. In terms of why that is, there's probably a lot we could unpack as to why. You're right that there's a priest shortage everywhere, and all those who are serving, really, they're home bishops, they're home archbishops. Huge kudos to them just for the generosity to permit those men to serve. It's really important service, and we're incredibly grateful to their bishops for permitting it. But the military archdiocese is not immune or insulated from those same shortage challenges that dioceses elsewhere face.
Right. So then let's go a little bit more into what does a Catholic chaplaincy or chapel look like, especially maybe how did they evolve? What is the kind of history of the U.S. military chaplaincy? But then in particular, how do these contracted supporting roles play in? Why were they so essential, and what's going to change, assuming that this isn't reversed and we don't have them?
Sure. Yeah. So the history of the chaplain corps it dates back to before the founding of the country, the Revolutionary War. General Washington requested of the Continental Congress that they would fund a chaplaincy, and in fact they did. Obviously, our country and even in the military looked different back then. A lot of the units that were formed back then were formed because a recruiter would go to a particular place, and sort of the enlistments were all kind of coming from, one town, one area. So there tended to be a bit more religious homogeneity, their uniformity within units. So you have, let's say, a unit that's largely comprised of Methodists. It'd be natural that they'd have a minister serving those unique needs. Obviously, as the country developed and undertook a bit of diversity, Roman Catholics fought in the Civil War in large numbers. That's the first place where Catholic chaplains really kind of rise to some prominence in serving, Irish immigrants. Even the metropolitan see where I'm sitting right now, the Archdiocese of St. Paul, Minneapolis. Their first Archbishop, John Ireland, was a sort of a famous Civil War chaplain before coming back home and serving in his local church. And all the way up through, the 20th century, some really famous military Catholic chaplains. The story of Saving Private Ryan is based on the story actually of a Catholic chaplain. It wasn't Lieutenant Winter that was going to search for Private Ryan. It was actually a chaplain who heard of sort of the death of this soldier's brothers, and it's like, oh, we got to go get this message to him. And that was later a Monsignor, at the time Father Francis Sampson, who went on to serve in Korea, and then ultimately in the 60s and 70s, I think, became the chief of chaplains, a two-star general. Emil Kapaun in Korea, and then Vincent Capodanno. These are all famous names of these last two Medal of Honor winners. So really served with great distinction. But the fundamental, like why a chaplaincy and what does it look like? Well, the part of Washington's recognition that Congress recognized in the 1850s, even before the Civil War, it's in congressional record, is that part of our commitment to free exercise, the Free Exercise Clause and the First Amendment to the Constitution, part of what that means for people who have entered our nation's service is that we actually, when they undertake a certain sacrifice on our behalf and leave hearth and home to move to a distant place where the practice of their faith maybe isn't as easily available, we actually, as a country, have an obligation to them to kind of give the basic infrastructure for them to freely exercise their faith. That's why you had chaplains going all the way back to the Revolutionary War, and that's been the commitment too of why we have chaplains on bases and why we even staff those chaplaincies out. Um, with all the demands on priests, we have an obligation to actually provide a support staff to serve in some of these functions.
Yeah, so what happened in this case? The contracts that were canceled, can you say, we talked about it at the beginning a little, but who are these contracted positions, and why is the loss of them, a big deal for the functioning of a military chaplaincy?
Yeah, so it's three positions: coordinators of religious education, that would be folks who are teaching the faith; Catholic pastoral life coordinators. I think of this person a little more as like your parish, maybe your parish secretary, which in the Army is saying like, look, anybody can pick up the phone and take notes in the calendar. But if you're Catholic and you know what a parish secretary does, like that person many times um, is like the glue that kind of holds a lot of the office together. And it's incredibly important that they have a deep understanding and love for the faith. Their job is incredibly important in terms of like holding together the life of the community in a way that makes sense. And then lastly, musician contracts. And again, this is something, as I mentioned earlier, that just goes to the heart of a beautiful liturgy. The source and summit of our life as Catholics, and that really special time for us together, Sunday Mass. The Army's taken the position that, oh, we've got other people that can just sort of cover down on these things. We've got other people that can fill the roles. Well, the fact of the matter is that the contracts have been canceled for some time now. Nobody is covering down on them. Um, and we need to find a solution. And I want to be fair to the Army too, because after the Archbishop's letter, um, you know, there's been an acknowledgement that they're going to reassess things, and that's the right move. Is like, okay, you know, we've made a misstep. We're going to take a fresh look, and and I get it too. I've been in the position as a military officer of like you're just trying to do your best with the limited resources you have. Okay, fair enough. So I don't think it's the right move to be really, casting aspersions, and I don't think that's what anybody's trying to do. But really, there is an obligation that falls to Congress and the Army in kind of making their appropriations requests. This is a very serious obligation that we have, and we have to fund it appropriately.
Yeah, I think you make a really good case, especially what you said a minute ago, that when people are making the sacrifice of hearth and home to go and defend the nation through military service, it's what you give them. I think obviously people of faith should be more than bare bones. Like, okay, we'll give you a priest and there'll be a mass on Sunday is not enough, right? That having
Yeah,
catechesis and having liturgy that is part of the church's tradition, like this makes sense, that you give them a coherent
that's right.
faith support.
That's
So
right.
I guess my question then is, if practically that's true, what happens here legally? Because I think the objection for someone who doesn't know this field very well would say, okay, like what are we supposed to do about it, right? This is a government contract and the government makes choices, and can you claim a free exercise violation? Like, what do we do here legally or politically to move forward and fix this?
Yeah, I mean, as somebody that a plaintiff with standing certainly could bring a claim, and there is language kind of affirming this free exercise line of thought that I've talked about. It's dicta in a Supreme Court case from the 60s, more recently in the 80s, Katkoff versus Marsh. So it's the free exercise sort of line of thought isn't just sort of a nice thought. It's got teeth in it. But before we would get to any sort of legal claim, I do think that the Army is going to figure this out. They've acknowledged we're going to reassess it, um, and and I think they're doing that in good faith. So I think very concrete next steps are, well, they've said they're going back to the drawing board. They're going to propose a new solution. Let's just give them um, a moment to draft that solution and advance it. We'll see what it looks like and assess it and go from there.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So I guess we've touched on this from a couple different angles, but I'll just ask practically, if nothing gets done, right? If we don't have these contracts in place and you have the chaplains, the Catholic chaplains who are already stretched quite thin and they don't have this support staff, what does that look like? Like what would we expect that to look like for your average, military chaplaincy or chapel?
Well, I mean, I know our popes and bishops in recent years have been talking about evangelization, right? About being heralds of the gospel wherever we are. And so really that's one of the fundamental things that falls is like we have this moment to share the good news as Catholics. There was some data recently. Ryan Burge, data scientist, I think he's a political scientist by trade, but he demonstrated that um, young people in the military, so age 18 to 44, they are going to church weekly or more at twice the rate of the civilian population. That's phenomenal. I mean, people serving in the military are really special. Now they're also, in many respects, kind of a crosscut of America. The percentage of nuns is the same as sort of civilians writ large. But once there's that decision to engage, it's like, okay, I'm going to do this thing. I'm going to do it. There's not a whole lot of middle ground, which means that for our brothers and sisters serving in the military, we want our our Catholic chaplains to be well resourced. We want those chapels to be places that are not only hubs of life for Catholics that are serving, but also just like they're able to answer the call whoever walks through their door. And if it's, a skeleton crew and the lights are barely on, it's just far more difficult to do that in a sustained way. I would point out too, if I can, to just sort of kind of continue that line of thought. I think that that's tremendously important just for our military as a whole. Like it's an incredibly powerful thing for Christian values, Christian ethics, like people of deep moral formation and responsibility to be in these positions, where life and death can be on the line. So it's yes, it is about Catholic chapels and serving the Catholic community, but it has a tremendously like profound impact for the good of all, in my view.
Yeah, and I think all the more reason that the people who are choosing to serve in the military should be supported spiritually by thriving chaplaincies, right? Everything from the the virtues, right, like honesty and courage that you would need for a functioning military, all the way to, having a sober but inspired view of death, right, of facing death
Right.
and dying well for the people who are actually risking their lives in service of the
Right.
country. I would think almost more than an average person would need that kind of spiritual support.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Well put.
Yeah, so and I think that right, the strain is all the more felt because of what you'd said earlier, not just that there aren't enough Catholic chaplains, but that they have different duties, right? So you figure your average parish community, for the most part, the pastor and his associate priests, if you have them, are their work most of the time is the care of the parish, right? The care of the souls there. So yeah, yes, they say mass and they hear confessions, but then the rest of their life is dedicated to visiting the family, speaking to people, being caring for the souls under their care, versus a military chaplain doesn't have the same luxury, it sounds like, from what you're saying. They're not just there 100% to care for the people who come into the chapel, right? They have other duties. They're advising, they're doing other things within the military. So that's a tremendous strain.
Yeah, that's right. So, and I don't mean to, that would be the typical life of a civilian parish pastor, and his vicars, although they, sort of canonically, theologically, every soul within their boundaries is sort of under their care. really the day-to-day life is focused on, it's very parish centric. But again, back to the military chaplaincy, you might be a lieutenant colonel, Catholic priest, and when you show up to work every day, you got that full bird colonel who's looking at you as sort of a spiritual advisor. You're serving whoever walks through your doors, whatever their faith may be. So there's really kind of these two hats in many respects.
Sure. Now, in recent history, I guess at all, in the history of the American military, and particularly the Catholic chaplaincy, have there been difficulties like this before? Have there been times when there have been, contracts canceled or insufficient staff given to chaplaincies? Have we looked at something like this in the past?
Yeah, unfortunately, it's becoming a recurring trend in the last decade. Some listeners may remember Walter Reed famously had some, they hit the national news for canceling contracts around, I think it was around Easter time, within the last 5 years or so. And I should mention this didn't come up earlier, but within the Archdiocese for Military Services, not only is it military chaplains, but the Archbishop oversees Catholic spiritual care within Veterans Administration hospitals as well as some federal facilities around the world. So the VA system is they're kind of always sorting through these contracting issues. But Walter Reed, and then also this was 2021, I think, the Navy out in San Diego axed some priest contracts. It happens that in some places there are civilian priests who have a contract maybe for a handful of masses on weekends. And where those are in place, I should admit, none of those are in play right now with this particular sort of iteration of the difficulties. They have been in play in the past. Where those civilian priests have a contract to say mass, on a Navy installation or an Air Force base, the service they provide is so incredibly necessary. And it was kind of like just with the Archbishop's letter in recent months, there was I think he had written a letter 2021. There was public outcry. The Navy ended up reversing course and reinstating those contracts. So you'd want to think that at a certain point in time, um, there would be maybe a higher level policy within the Department of Defense, just kind of giving more scrutiny and review before they would terminate some of these contracts. Um, they need to. And unfortunately, I think it's just a symptom of the decline of Christianity in broader culture. My read on it is not that there's outright malice or outright, sort of anti-Catholic bias behind the cancellation of these contracts, but more than anything else, it's just ignorance. People who are not, people of faith themselves. For a person who isn't a believer, it can be like sort of an alien mindset to even understand how important, how sacred this is to a Catholic in uniform, to be able to have the sacraments available as you're undertaking a difficult and at times deadly duty. So it's not a new thing though, unfortunately.
So where do you think this will go? I know this has been kind of back and forth for a few months now, but is there any any bright side, any hope that things are going to move the right way and reverse this contract cancellation?
Yeah, I do think the Army, I'm very optimistic that the Army, like they've said, they're taking a new look. I think that's uh, sort of a diplomatic way to say just, okay, give us a little time and we'll reinstate things. So I think there's reason for optimism. There are a lot of good people working, wonderful, wonderful, hardworking people working in the chief of chaplain's office. Unfortunately, the contract cancellation was sort of happened in this distant command, and it didn't get any chaplain review
Mhm.
before it happened. So yeah, I think there's cause for optimism. We're also going to see next year, not in the current iteration of the National Defense Authorization Act, but in 2026, when Congress is looking at the fiscal year 27 NDAA, which is sort of must pass legislation every year. Um, there's there's a bill that's being advanced by Representative Self, representative from Texas, called the Military Chaplains Act, that really elevates the chaplaincy in many respects, heightens their role as an advisor within command structures, gives them greater conscience protections. And while it doesn't speak to contracting directly, anything we can do that really elevates the role of chaplains and chapel services is really important. It sort of puts it in decision makers' minds that, hey, this is something important. It's something that Congress expects of us, that the American people expect of us, and we need to treat it with due seriousness.
Yeah, I think I also want to highlight something you wrote about this. So I took this from you. You had that piece fairly recently at, I think it was at The Hill, is that right, on this issue?
Right. Yeah.
And because I think a lot of people would be concerned and say, hey, we're, trillions of dollars in the hole with, budget deficits and a national debt. And you
Yeah.
pointed out you had a couple of, I mean, it would be humorous if it wasn't such a heavy topic, but some statistics that show like what a drop in the bucket this is of the military budget. Do you want to just maybe highlight that for a minute?
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
in the public record, I found an Air Force base where, these contracts are like 15 grand for the year for one base. Kind of off the record, I was hearing from other sources that's very, like, that's a normal range, like
Okay.
15, 20 grand for a base. You've got 220 installations that are being served by Catholic chapels. Um, Compare that to um, the cost of an Excalibur, GPS guided artillery round that's 100 grand a piece, being reported from Ukraine. We're selling them to Ukraine. They don't work there anyways because the Russians are jamming the GPS. I don't even get me started on the cost of like a Tomahawk missile, or even some of the bigger drones and whatnot that we're using, and we kind of lose these things in like, oh, there's a couple million. It's what we're talking about. The point is what we're talking about is a drop in the bucket in the scheme of the defense budget. Um, and kind of back to my earlier point, like, it's of tremendous import and value. This isn't just sort of some niche special interest of, we'll sort of throw these guys a bone because they're such a squeaky wheel. This brings incredible value to like the moral and ethical decision making of our entire like military apparatus. We want Christians that are well formed, that are well fed, that see the military as a place where they can have like a flourishing like role in the life of their country. It's not a good thing if our military is stripped of Christian support.
Yeah, that's a great way to summarize what's at stake here. You're not a budget breaking cost, but also spiritually and for virtue in the military for so many reasons, a really important
Yeah.
thing to have in place. I guess as we close, I'm just curious if because you focus on military religious issues in your work at First Liberty. So for people who are interested in this issue in general, religious exercise and in the military. Is there anything you want to highlight, things you're working on or things that you think are important to watch in this area? Because it's something that a lot of religious liberty observers are probably not thinking about very often. So I wanted to kind of give you a chance to highlight anything you
Yeah,
want.
thank you. One thing to highlight would be the ongoing work of the White House's Religious Liberty Commission. They just had their most recent meeting was in Dallas last week, and it focused on military issues. So one thing that I'm gonna be watching closely for myself, and would encourage anybody who's interested to watch for, would be the final recommendations
Mhm.
of that commission once they've concluded their work and are ready to make recommendations to the president. Those recommendations could be really important in terms of kind of structural and procedural changes, for kind of how we can improve the way that we do business in terms of religious liberty in the military.
Yeah, there's been some really amazing work. We always like to highlight what the Religious Liberty Commission is doing, especially because our former executive director here, Mary Margaret Bush, is the director of the commission. But they've been highlighting really in every area, from military to education. They've really done a great service to making these issues known. So that's a great way to close.
Yeah. Well, and if I can just maybe share one anecdote from the testimony last week, and this is
Yeah,
maybe
please.
interesting to your listeners who are in private practice, really no connection to the military. There was testimony last week from a man in private industry who makes dog tags and has had a license from the military to put sort of military trademarks on dog tags that had scripture verses on them. He was told by the Department of Defense, they said, we can't license our trademark, our intellectual property to you because you have scripture on your dog tags, and we just can't have those two things together. Um, my organization represented this man. His organization is called Shields of Strength. His business, produced a very positive result, and in fact, you can, put a military mark. So it's, you may have lawyers in your network that are doing kind of military contracting or have some sort of business connection in the military. And their work is incredibly important too. And not only is it important, they're protected in terms of, now that the lemon test is gone, we're not required to sort of keep the naked square or the public square naked, in Father Newhouse's words.
Yes. No, anytime I get a chance to highlight and emphasize that the Establishment Clause does not mean that the government can't have any involvement with religion, I take that opportunity. That's not what it means. It's
Right.
very much about establishing one denomination or religion over another, and it really doesn't mean much more than that. So, yes, certainly something as harmless as putting scripture verses and military insignia on the same dog tag is certainly not what the founders thought they were doing, preventing with the Establishment Clause.
That's right.
All right. Well, with that, I think we'll wrap up. So, to our listeners, thank you for joining us for this special episode of the Napa Legal Podcast. We hope you'll join us next week as we continue to highlight the most important issues in religious liberty and the work of faith-based nonprofit organizations. If you want to support the work we're doing, you can like and follow and all of that on YouTube and Spotify and wherever you're listening from. If you want to support our work, you can go to napalegalinstitute.org and do so there. And we will join you next time. So thank you for listening. And Chris, thank you so much for being on. It's great to have you.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.